Now, journalists and espionage. Former Deputy Attorney General Jamie Gorelick, The Washington Post's Bob Woodward, foreign policy specialist Richard Haass, and others look at journalists' contacts with foreign agents and their use of sources with intelligence-gathering agencies. Random House Publishing hosted this hour-long discussion.
Greetings, everyone. Please listen while you're eating. My name is David Ignatius, and I want to welcome all of you, except whoever just hissed, to Nora's Restaurant and to our discussion of spies and journalists. Should any contact be a firing offense? I can promise you a good meal, which your panel has already devoured upstairs, and I think I can promise you a good discussion of an issue that matters both to the news business and to the intelligence business, both of which are well represented on our panel and in the audience. As many of you know, I work as assistant managing editor for business news at the Washington Post. Through the tolerance of my employers who are represented here, I'm also moonlighting as a spy novelist, and I have just published a new novel called A Firing Offense, which, as you may have noticed, bears a slight resemblance to the title of the discussion today. My book tells the story of a journalist who commits what many of us in the press would consider the ultimate firing offense, namely working with the CIA in an intelligence operation, and in the process of doing that, destroys his career. I first began thinking about this issue of the boundaries between journalism and intelligence nearly 20 years ago when I started covering the CIA for the Wall Street Journal. Later, when I served as a correspondent for the Journal in Beirut in the 1980s, I was convinced that my safety depended on the absolute separation of these two worlds and my ability to tell anyone, anywhere, that I worked only for my newspaper and its readers. And that's still my professional opinion. But as a novelist, I've tried in this book to imagine a situation in which a serious, honorable reporter would become so convinced that he was doing the right thing morally in helping the CIA that he would agree knowingly, wittingly to violate what he and most of us would regard as a basic rule of professional ethics. And that's the issue that we want to discuss with all of you today. Should contact between spies and journalists be a firing offense? What should the rules be? Our panelists, I think, are well known to most of you, and let me briefly introduce them. Richard Haass, immediately to my right, is Director of Foreign Policy Studies at the Brookings Institution and was a top NSC official during the Bush administration, and as you'll see in a moment, was a leading troublemaker on this issue a year ago. Jim Woolsey was Director of Central Intelligence during the early years of the Clinton administration. He's now a partner in the law firm of Shea and Gardner. Jamie Gorelick was the Clinton administration's Deputy Attorney General until about a month ago. Before that, she served as General Counsel of the Defense Department. In both those jobs, she was deeply involved in intelligence issues. Bob Woodward, in addition to being the best known and, for my money, the best reporter in America, is an assistant managing editor at the Washington Post and author of many books that deal with intelligence and national security. And Evan Thomas is assistant managing editor of Newsweek magazine, author of The Very Best Men, which many people, me included, think is the very best book on the early years of the CIA. We have a distinguished, interesting audience gathered here. I hope you'll join in the discussion when we open it up later for questions. We'll try to get all of you out of here and back to work in about an hour. I want to begin the discussion by asking the person who put this issue on the public agenda, Richard Haass, to set the stage for us. Early last year, Richard authored a report for the Council on Foreign Relations urging that journalists, journalistic cover should be available again for the CIA and intelligence operations. In the brouhaha that followed Richard's report, it turned out that the CIA already had authority to do precisely that, although we in the press, for the most part, hadn't realized it. So Richard, get us started.
Thank you, David. It's good to be here, part for the quality of the book, in part for the quality of the panel. I promised, though, that I'd begin with a disclaimer that I'm here in my personal capacity and not as the husband of my journalist wife. The The line in the report that I authored that triggered this controversy, let me just read it to you. We simply recommended, and by we I'm talking about a task force of about 25 people, most of whom had served in government before. It was an independent task force. And we recommended that a fresh look be taken at limits on the use of non-official covers for hiding and protecting those involved in clandestine activities. And let me for a second just give you the logic train of what led us to that recommendation. And it's really simply 3 or 4 points. First, that the need for intelligence remains extremely high despite the end of the Cold War and despite, say, the internet or the globalization of information. Secondly, that the need for human intelligence, as opposed to what satellites would provide or what intercepts of signals would provide, that the need for human intelligence is also extremely high and arguably higher than it ever was before. Thirdly, that the utility of traditional covers, and these are people, say, who would operate out of U.S. embassies, and they would be the third attaché for something or other, but in effect they would be working for the CIA, that the utility of these traditional covers has plummeted. And the reason in many cases is obvious, that most of the countries who now provide the biggest targets for American intelligence happen to be countries where we do not even have embassies. So the idea that we could use them as platforms is simply not available. Similarly, many of the groups we are now worried about, non-state actors, are obviously by definition groups or people who we do not have embassies that could provide covers or platforms. So the idea is that we increasingly have to think about using non-traditional covers to provide the necessary intelligence that feeds into American foreign and defense policy. The idea, as David mentioned, that we suggested in this report was picked up by a young aspiring journalist at the Washington Post named Walter Pincus. The story took on a life of its own. Unlike all of you in this room, this is one of those situations where I wrote something and then learned a lot more about it after it was published. Despite that, let me just say, and I've had more than a little time to think about it, I still think it was the right recommendation. And let me just give you the argumentation. Firstly, I agree with the critics to the extent that I think the bias versus the use of journalists as spies is essentially right. Journalists as spies does create questions about legitimacy, about physical safety, about effectiveness, and all the rest. But secondly, and just as important, I think we need to retain the option to use journalists as spies in situations where first the stakes are extremely high, and second that there's no obvious alternative. Thirdly, and just to alienate some other important groups in American society, I would say the same thing about several other categories. I would say it about clergy. I would say it about academics, of which I am one. I would say it about businessmen. I would even say it about the Peace Corps. I do not think the United States has the luxury of an ironclad denial to itself of using people in these career areas if the situation warrants. I don't think, whether it's journalists or anybody else, that we should do so casually. I think there needs to be a very tight procedure for doing this thing. I think, like the character in David's book, like Eric Truel, it ought to be voluntary, obviously. No pressure ought to be brought to bear on the potential individual who might be so involved. I think we're kidding ourselves if we don't think such suspicion already exists. So even if Jim Woolsey's successors were going to stand up and say we would never, ever, ever, ever do it in any situation, I think we're kidding ourselves if that pledge would be taken at face value. And I think, and I'll end with this because David asked us to be short, I don't think this is all that different than an awful lot of other tough public policy questions. That there's a price for going this route, and I would simply say there's a price for not, and I think it's got to be decided case by case, and I think you've got to be willing to make the tough choices. This is clearly one of them, but I would simply say in an age of rogue states, unconventional weapons, terrorism, and the rest, to deny the use of journalists or several of these other categories as a means for espionage is to deny what might be the only tool that would stand between the United States and a disaster on a large scale.
Bob Woodward, what do you, as an experienced journalist who's seen a lot of different kind of stories, a lot of the world, think about what Richard proposes?
Well, first of all, essentially Richard's argument is that the ends justify the means, which I disagree with, and the treasured commodity for a reporter is his or her independence, and being tagged or even being suspected of working for the CIA is equivalent to being tagged or suspected of working for one of the political parties. And the other element is the practical dimension. I remember being in Tripoli, Libya, 1984, reporting on Colonel Gaddafi and being apprehended by some of the police and taken to, it wasn't a jail, it was a room outside of a jail. And I was very glad that I had written stories that the CIA didn't like, and that I was not on Director Casey's Christmas card list. In fact, I had written stories about the CIA's efforts to overthrow Gaddafi. So it was very reassuring to have that on the ledger rather than an enhanced suspicion, which only grows by you and former Director Deutsch declaring this publicly. That's what I don't understand. I mean, why not? You say it would be done under extraordinary circumstances. There are all kinds of things done under extraordinary circumstances that you don't have to make and get up and make a policy declaration on.
Bob, can you imagine a situation in which you would ever do what Eric does in this book? That is to say, agree to help the agency in intelligence operations?
In the case in the book where Eric goes to China and he is assigned and agreed with the CIA that he will carry a message to a scientist, which will allow the scientist to contact somebody and then be exfiltrated out of the country. This scientist is working on biological warfare in a very dramatic way, and there are undertows. The undertone is that the scientist's life would be saved, and that perhaps some sort of biological holocaust would be averted. I can see doing it. The approach I would take would be different than Eric's. I would go to my editor and say, do you want to do this? Who would then go to the publisher, Don Graham, who I think probably would say yes. Over the objections of the editor, no doubt.
That's a perfect segue for me to ask Leonard Downey, the executive editor of the Washington Post, who was enjoying his lunch. Len, I know this is an issue you've thought really seriously about. This is not an abstract issue or an issue of novel writing, but one you took seriously enough that you went to see the Director of Central Intelligence to talk through what the Washington Post and our journalistic community thinks and needs. Just talk a little bit about how you look at it.
Well, in the case of Bob's hypothetical, no, I wouldn't allow him to do that. And if Don Graham ordered me to allow him to do that, I'd resign. As indeed I did resign from the Council of Foreign Relations after they would not disown Mr. Haas's report, because I think it's that dangerous that the Council of Foreign Affairs appears to endorse Mr. Haas's views. And I agree with Bob that even for Mr. Haas's statement today, it's dangerous to the safety of journalists throughout the world. And I resent it deeply, and I think it's very dangerous. And we told Director Deutsch that for him to leave this open as a hypothetical also was dangerous to journalists around the world. In addition to trying to have them understand the unique role that American journalists play under the First Amendment in this country, and that our independence from government generally is very important for our work. It's not just that we don't do things for the CIA, we don't do things for the local police or the local prosecutor or the Pentagon or anybody else. We must remain independent of them. And Jamie Gorelick's presence reminds me of the very difficult discussions that the editors of the New York Times and the Washington Post had with the Justice Department and the FBI over the question of publishing the Unabomber's manifesto. And one of the things we appreciated was that throughout those discussions, it never was a cooperative venture. It was two different groups of people who realized that they're on different sides of a divide, talking something out, and we made our decision solely independently.
Let me ask Jim Woolsey to talk a minute about how you look at this issue if you're Director of Central Intelligence?
I find myself on this question in a very comfortable position, agreeing with Bob Woodward about halfway in between Richard and Len. I think, as has been the policy since the Carter administration, and as I understand it was issued publicly at that time, any intelligence community use of a journalist is supposed to be a very rare thing, but the Director of Central Intelligence is permitted essentially a waiver authority, which is used in the book, in extraordinary circumstances. I think that it should be a very, very rare thing. Journalists are different than people in other businesses for some of the same reasons that Lynn Downey stated. But there can be circumstances in which is a life or death matter, in a matter involving weapons of mass destruction. It would be in the country's interest to make an exception. I'm not sure, by the way, that circumstance arises in the book. Eric's, most of his cooperation with the CIA is simply trading information. He gets information on background, he gets information off the record, he uses it in stories, no constraints are put on his use until he agrees to carry a message to Dr. Navarre, the French scientist who is almost but not quite captive of the Chinese and working on this horrible biological weapon. Essentially, it's being able to weaponize mad cow disease. And he is in the position somewhat of, as the book says, of an Oppenheimer. He's someone the Chinese need badly in order to carry out this weaponization. I think this hinges in many ways, whether or not this would be something that a DCI today would or should approve, hinges very importantly on your view of the current situation in China. If one substituted Nazi Germany for China, or one substituted today's Iran with an absolute commitment to turn this weaponized biological system over to Hezbollah, I think the decision would be relatively easy. And in spite of the principles which Len set out, I think that this would be the right decision for the DCI to grant an exception and permit the journalist to be approached with respect to the exfiltration. I must say I agree with Bob. I would expect the journalist under these circumstances to go to his editor and publisher, and indeed, if I were DCI and something like this came up, I would suggest it. I would think that the journalist owed that to his institution, and that would be the way that he should operate.
Len, forgive me, but I want to just ask you whether the Nazi Germany analogy makes any difference to you. Is there a situation that would be so horrible and the good that the journalist could do would be so obvious that you'd have a different view?
This is why I don't normally like to discuss hypotheticals, because you can probably figure out some circumstance that would trap somebody into almost any response. But usually we look for alternatives. Usually we would urge alternatives, and that's what we would do here. And I don't know if the end of the world is approaching, if that suddenly makes all rules in life different than they are. But within anything that I can imagine, I would say that this is not something we should do, not something we should participate in. There usually are alternatives.
Jamie Gorelick, talk about how this issue looked to you when you were sitting as a member of the Deputies Committee dealing with the most sensitive intelligence issues before the government. What do you think about it?
Well, we had not this situation, but some analogous situations, one having to do with the use of clergy, not American clergy, but foreign clergy, as to which there's no prohibition. But nevertheless, there was a really lengthy and deep discussion within the Deputies Committee about that. And ultimately, the kind of considerations that Jim has described were brought to bear. That is, the target was not considered so important to risk the faith of the people of that country and their clergy. That is the competing interest that Len has been talking about. And the second analogous situation really is the Unabomber situation, where we did together struggle through very, very difficult issues. And even though it is true that the newspapers reached their conclusion to help publish the manifesto on their own, there was certainly no directive, but we did indicate what we thought could be gained in terms of stopping the harm that was occurring if the manifesto were published. I think that, nevertheless, the decision was made to be of assistance. And I think that if there were circumstances that were grievous enough, that were threatening enough, indeed, there would be a lot of publishers, a lot of ultimate decision makers who would have the reaction that Bob did, which is that they would go ahead and allow that activity in service of the country to proceed. The harm, let's look at the harm for a moment. The harm is one in having journalists generally be seen as tools of their government, and that is a harm. There's no question about that. But to a certain extent, I think that it is true that that is already the perception abroad. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but it is nevertheless the case. The bigger problem, I think, is that people will perceive news that is affected by an affiliation to be impartial, and you can cure that by disclosure. I mean, you could, in the situation posited here, have had the blessing of the newspaper and then disclosure after the fact of what had occurred, and nothing written about it that would not have disclosed the relationship between the report, if anything was written about it, that would not have disclosed the relationship between the reporter and the agency. Again, I'm not saying that this should be an everyday occurrence. In fact, I think that the fact that there is a general prohibition on it is critically important. But I guess I could not rule out a circumstance in which I would come to the conclusion that there was no other choice and that it was the right thing to do.
Jamie, I know that you think that journalists sometimes get themselves into more trouble than they realize in what they think of as innocent source relationships, where they're going to see people in the intelligence community or in law enforcement, and a trading of information ensues. Talk about the issues involved there, because that's how Eric in the book begins to get in trouble. That's where the slippery slope starts.
Well, I think that there is a scale of activity between a reporter and a source. I mean, I'm speaking, of course, as a source to many people in this room. And I've seen stories spun by folks that I didn't think were providing sort of straight scoop. The fact of the matter is that every day your job is to discern the motivation of someone who's giving you information to manipulate it. So you're always on guard against that. And it seems to me that that increases when you believe that the person has something that they want to gain. Now, what can they give you? Well, they can give you special access, and that is worth a whole lot more to a reporter than most kinds of considerations that you could have. And we all know, in fact, that there are people who are perceived to be the mouthpiece, if you will, of some part of the government or some sub-part of some part of the government. And so there is that danger. And so the question really that I would pose is how different, because I know it is a difference of quantity and quality, how different is it for a reporter to be tasked, essentially? Because I've had conversations with reporters in which I've said, well, you want to know X, and I can't give you X until I know more about what you've got. So you go find out Y, and if you find out Y, then I'll be able to tell you X. And finding out Y is in my interest, and for you, finding out X is in your interest. Well, that's a species of trade that happens every day in this town, and almost everybody in this room knows that.
Evan, you know a lot about journalists and you know a lot about spies. How do you thread your way through these issues?
Well, first of all, journalists probably make bad spies because they talk too much. I mean, I sort of have a hard time imagining the CIA getting a journalist to do anything for it because they wouldn't trust him.
They'd have to be desperate.
They'd have to be really desperate. I also think this is not the kind of thing where you make rules because, I mean, I think Len's got to be an absolutist and he's got to say, we never would do that because that's got to be the position of the press. But as a practical matter, one time every decade, maybe, in a horrible situation, as a practical matter, you'd come to the Post, the Times, or wherever, and the reporter wouldn't do it unilaterally. He'd go see Bradley or Len, or whoever was running the show, and then they'd go see Don, and there'd be anguished discussions about it, and they would try to find a compromise, and they probably would find a compromise. But once in a century, maybe.
And somebody would keep notes for their book.
then the whole thing would leak. That's what I think.
Ben, do you want to, your book talks about an example just like this, where, you know, somebody came to Bob with some information that was genuinely damaging, seemed to be, to the national security, and in your book you talk about what seemed like the right thing to do. Do you want to just briefly describe that?
Well, I think you're all looking for permission to do this. And I think that's where you're falling, that's where it just becomes an impossible. If you ask us for our permission to do this, you're going to get no, and any editor who would give you permission ought to be thrown out. And I think the flip side is true also, that any editor or journalist who asks for some kind of permission to bless him, to save his ass is what we're talking about. It seems to me that I can imagine easily circumstances. The Nazi Germany is one, a friend is another, a relative is another, a wife, a child. Of course you do it. I don't think that's a big deal. But I wouldn't tell anybody about it, and I would not go to Don Graham in that case. I don't think I would.
So you wouldn't expect David to
And
come
then
to you
when
with
they
that?
get caught at it, too bad, fella. I never saw you, I never talked to you, I don't know anything about it. You don't know what's from that. And I think that's diplomacy, isn't it? I mean, diplomacy works that way all the time. Deniability. If in Eric's case, I don't know, Jesus, I'd hate to disagree with my successor, but I'm not sure I wouldn't have done it.
I would note in the book, Eric never questions that he has committed a firing offense, that he's broken the rules, and that he basically should be fired. So he's accepting the kind of stricture that Len's laying down.
I'm not sure he did.
Well, Jim being a lawyer, has done a wonderful textual analysis of this book and has concluded that he didn't commit a firing offense because paragraph C is badly drafted.
If you look at the front of the book, at the New York Mirror Handbook on Style, it says reporters should not ordinarily engage in outside activities and jobs. That's especially true of connections with government, etc., firing offense. Now, the official or the reporter who has a job with an intelligence service in this book is not Eric, but rather Arthur Bowman. And his job, for which he is compensated handsomely, is with the French intelligence service. CIA doesn't pay anybody in this relationship. They essentially ask Eric to do them a favor, to carry a message to a man whose life is at stake and is trying to get out of China. So I'm not certain the lawyers for the Mirror drafted their constraint correctly, because I'm not sure Eric violated their rule. I quite do agree that it was up to the Director of Central Intelligence in this case to have approved granting a waiver and to have approved his case officer talking to Eric and getting Eric to carry the message to the scientist. I think the CIA acted properly, but I'm not sure, given their rule book, that the Mirror called it right. I'm not sure Eric broke their rule.
I'm glad there's a legal way out of this. I was worried there for a minute. We have a room full of editors and journalists, and I want to give any of you a chance to weigh in on the question that we've been discussing. You know, what ought the rules to be? If there's anybody who'd like to jump in now.
May I ask something,
Yeah.
Bob? Bob said, I think you said, that what you would have preferred here is for the announced policy to be that journalists are off limits, and for Deutsch not to have said that there could be some extraordinary circumstance in which there would be a waiver, even if that was the case. Now, I guess that makes me want to ask, doesn't that elevate the reporter's interest in being seen by the world as pure and beyond access over the truth, which I thought you might be more interested in?
Absolutely fair point. But the difficulty is there is a policy, and as you spend some time looking at government policies or newspaper policy, we all have them, and we all always make exceptions to them. And every time we announce a policy, we don't sit and list the hypotheticals where we might deviate from the policy. And I'm mildly astounded that so much was made of this to say, oh, we might stick our foot in the muck on this, but our policy is not. I think Len is right that in the practical world, there almost always would be alternatives, and you would have to explore that fully before undertaking such an effort. And the case described magnificently in David's book is simply delivering a message to save somebody's life. The operational involvement does not go beyond that, right?
Right.
And, you know, generally speaking, if somebody's going to say to me, if you just deliver a message to somebody, you're going to save somebody's life, my inclination is to do it. Now, the remedy in this case, if the reporter did it with authorization from the editor and the publisher, under that exceptional circumstance, I think the cleansing event would be to write about it fully and say that, yes, we undertook this.
Scoop the editors.
Yeah, scoop the editors, that's right.
And in the book,
Right.
the CIA case officer gives Eric the authority to write about this. He just says, hold up for a while we get this scientist resettled, so you don't foul up the resettlement of him under a false name. But once we get that done, you can go ahead and write about
But
it.
it's not fair to have a rule which you have no waiver on, because then what you're essentially doing is setting up government officials to break their own policies or even to break the law. And if you have a rule that doesn't have a waiver, which is essentially what I hear you're asking, that's unfair. Because too many people have been left holding the bag on too many occasions. You can't ask people who already, I think, are making sufficient sacrifices to go into public life to begin with, to essentially violate their own rules under exceptional circumstances. You've got to give them a way to do it. That is the whole purpose of the current approach. You have a very strong bias against doing this. You do have an authority, a waiver authority, that can't be used lightly. And that's the only way I know to protect the interests of people on both sides, people in government who shouldn't be asked to break the rules, and in this case, the interests of journalists.
Let me just give the argument why there shouldn't be a waiver. I can remember situations when I was a foreign correspondent in which I literally said to people, you know, who would raise this issue, you know, people in the Arab world who look at me skeptically and say, aha, I'll bet you have some intelligence connection, and I would say, there is a rule against that. That is illegal. There's an administrative order. You know, even if the agency wanted to, even if I wanted to, it is not possible, which I thought in good faith was true at that time. And as soon as I mean, today if I said that to this imaginary fellow, he'd say, aha, but there's a waiver. You know, in other words, you can't say that to me in good faith. And that's the reason to make it absolute, is to give that poor guy, I mean, you know, in our business, we're here in Washington and, you know, having a great meal at Norris. There are a lot of our colleagues who were in very distant places who face this situation. And for them, it's real nice to have a no-waiver policy.
Could I ask Richard a question? Do you have a personal policy of not killing people?
You know, my own personal life?
Yes.
No,
What?
of course not.
You do not have that policy.
I would think I have the same right to self-defense than anybody else would.
But your policy is you don't go around killing people, right?
As a rule of thumb.
Yes,
sure.
that's right. So there are times when you would make an exception to that, and I don't think you would declare that or have the little thing in your wallet that says I give myself a waiver to shoot you because it's self-defense.
But the law declares that.
It does. But
And when we have legal processes for doing that, what I am simply saying is that for people who are in the U.S. government, you are not asking them to act in their personal capacities anymore. We are hiring them, they are citizens, they come to work for our government, and they have official capacities. You are then saying, here's the laws, we expect you to keep them. An exception comes up, we're then asking these people to do what's best for the country, even if in 2 years they're going to be hauled up in front of some congressional committee because it didn't turn out right. No, that is why you've got to have waiver authorities to protect the legitimate interests of people in the U.S. government. Journalists, again, are not the only people in this equation who have important stakes. I think the country has important stakes, and I think U.S. government officials have important stakes.
You really mean to say, Richard, that the interests of bureaucratic ass covering are greater in the society than the interests of preserving the First Amendment and its validity, which is what I just heard you say.
If you heard me say that, you know, then I did not make my case clear. We're not talking about ass covering.
That was Robert Kaiser for our C-SPAN and radio audience.
We're saying two things, Bob. We're not talking about bureaucratic ass covering. We're talking about potentially protecting people from legal repercussions of what it is they do. If one takes a decision under extraordinary circumstances that then turns out badly, there has to, I think, be some protection against congressional and legal inquiries. Secondly, I think you're exaggerating to say that somehow we're putting the First Amendment on the plate here. Come on, you know, journalists demonstrate umpteen times a day their independence of their government. We are talking about the most extreme of circumstances that may come up once a year, once every 5 years, once a decade. And we're not talking about this as normal operating procedure. To just somehow exaggerate what is a waiver that would probably be used in extremely rare occasions, only when I think extraordinary stakes, we met the test of that, as well as the test of unique access. And you're saying to me that that somehow jeopardizes the First Amendment, I would say that's not a serious political or intellectual argument on your part.
Well, if indeed the circumstances are so rare and so unusual that it's really extremely unimaginable and not characteristic of the ordinary line of business that this would ever be imposed, I would posit that you don't have to worry about the consequences. Abraham Lincoln suspended habeas corpus in the whole Constitution, and nobody ever took him to task for it in a serious way.
As a practical matter, though, as the person who sat in the lawyer's chair in those committee meetings, if there were a rule that couldn't be waived, and someone came and said, it's an extraordinary circumstance, we need a waiver, I mean, I would have said, you can't do it. And so I don't think the question is who gets hauled up before a committee. I think that you have to posit that people are going to follow the rules, and therefore that whatever the dire circumstances are, the action would not be taken. I think that's only fair for the debate.
I think Jamie's right. This is really a situation where you have to decide whether you want it ever to happen or not. If you can imagine a situation in which you think it would ever be reasonable, and I think one of the reasons this is a very fine novel is that this situation is very close to the line. You can go either way on this one. But that's a function of the international situation, the post-Cold War era in which there aren't any real powerful enemies out there, but there are some fairly small, nasty ones. And if you believe that under some circumstances, for North Korea, for Iran, for Iraq today, for a red-brown Russia tomorrow, there ought to be some circumstances in which a journalist could reasonably be asked by the federal government, by the CIA, to do something similar to what Eric does. I think you have to allow for the possibility of the waiver existing in the regulation.
Just asking?
Surely, that's all they do. They don't have any power over it, they ask.
I want to ask Charles McCary, who's in the audience, who in my book is the Dean of American Spy Novelists, and also was a deep cover intelligence officer himself, to just offer a little factual evidence. Mac, how does journalistic cover work in practice?
Not very well. Back in the late 50s, from the late 50s to the late 60s, I was under what was laughingly called deep cover for the CIA. And I wandered into all sorts of places in the world and contacted all sorts of people. But using a variety of covers, but journalism was not one of them. And the reason was that I perceived it to be lousy cover. The Brits, the French, especially the Russians, and I suppose the Hittites and the Chaldeans have used it to a fairly well, so that I felt that it would put you under immediate suspicion. So I didn't use it. After all, Kim Philby was under journalistic cover when he was caught signaling with black light off that balcony of Beirut. After I left the agency, I might say I was a journalist before I went in, and when I left, I became a journalist again. I was frequently challenged when I went out as a legitimate journalist representing such respectable publications as the Saturday Evening Post and the Geographic. And specifically, I remember once arriving in the island of Grenada the day after the revolution. Didn't know what had happened. The Geographic I was there for the National Geographic, and the Geographic researchers had prepared a little packet of materials for me, which included sailing directions and airline map or airplane maps, and lists of local prominent people with photographs of the beaches and so on and so forth. And I was hauled into a room with about 15 guys, all of whom had a Kalashnikov of some kind and a Cuban fatigue cap. And they kept me in there for 5 or 6 hours. And I was perfectly innocent. But what convinced them that I probably was not innocent was my journalistic credentials. You know, if I was really a journalist, why did I come there to cover a revolution that nobody knew had happened? And explaining to them that it was pure coincidence didn't work any better than it works in novels, so they simply didn't accept it. But finally, they let me go. I think in the days in which I was working, these moral questions were less puzzling, perhaps because there was less effort made to define them. I did not use journalistic cover because I thought I would contaminate the whole profession if I were caught, but because I just thought it was impractical. And I might say, in the hope of not giving offense, that it seems to me that it's right for the press to insist on its virtue. But it's a little like the virginity of the prom queen. What happened at the drive-in movie doesn't really count.
I'd love to think about that. Dan Shore, who's in our audience. Dan, you've been writing and thinking and broadcasting about intelligence issues for several decades, and in the 1950s you were actually arrested by the KGB in Moscow in effect on spying charges. So you've lived this issue as few people have. Talk about it.
When I was a CBS correspondent in Moscow in the mid-1950s, the Soviets allowed correspondents to bring in duty-free liquor and food from outside, and when we said, that's very nice of you, they said, well, why not? We know you work for the CIA, so we'll treat you like other diplomats. I said, ha-ha, and that was very funny. And when I came back to New York, eventually I learned that Mr. William S. Paley, the chairman, had in the 1950s signed an agreement with the CIA that would provide for giving CBS journalistic cover to a couple of CIA agents. We were very shocked. In fact, I had the duty of getting that story on the CBS Evening News, which is something I would not like to do twice. In any event, you began to realize that there had been relationships, sometimes forged in the interest of patriotism. It was a matter in the 1950s of we're at war, at a kind of war with the Soviets, and everything that you can do will help. Mr. Paley agreed and was willing to do that. He was willing, for example, when Nikita Khrushchev came to the United Nations, to allow CIA lip readers in the CBS booth overlooking the United Nations Assembly. in order to be able possibly to read the lips of Khrushchev when he said something to one of his people there. And this sense of cooperation with the CIA went very far. I found out that there was a CIA person who used to come early in the morning and listen to all the radio reporters reporting from around the world for the World News Roundup. And occasionally the editor would ask a question of the correspondent, which the CIA person had asked him to ask that reporter, which we didn't know until a lot later. What do I think of it? I've had, on the whole, some people may laugh about this, as a foreign correspondent, very good relations with the CIA. But the relations which were bounded this way. If I went to Budapest, for example, I found the CIA station chief was a lot smarter than the minister who was there, and I found it very interesting to exchange words with him. In Berlin, the CIA station chief was a friend of mine, and if I made a trip to East Germany, I would come back and exchange thoughts with him about what was going on in East Germany. The criterion for it always was that I never told him anything that I had not already, or was at least planning to report on the air. Once they asked, when I was in the Soviet Union, they said, you're going to go to Sverdlovsk, would you take a look for us at would you count how many MiG planes there are parked on the at the airfield of Sverdlovsk? I said, no, because that's nothing that I would report about on the air. There really is a lot of cooperation, legitimate cooperation that goes on. If you can talk to a foreign service officer, you can certainly talk to a CIA officer, frequently more knowledgeable, I must say, than the equivalent foreign service officer. When it comes down to what you write in your novel, that of course is kind of the ultimate test and trial. I used to have very absolute ideas about this. I said Nick Daniloff got into trouble because they assumed that he was a CIA spy, having heard that the CIA did that. So what it does is to make it very difficult for all journalists all the time, once the impression has spread that they are or may be agents of the CIA. And yet, we live in a time of no absolutes. I think when the Post decided that it was going to publish the Unabomber screed as it did, even though they claim they had no consultation or didn't do it for the FBI, but the FBI did recommend it. It helped indeed to locate the Unabomber and all the rest of it. I think in these unabsolute times we live in, we cannot at any point say that here we go, we'll never go further. There may be a time when it's in the interest of persons, people, or the whole country that you do something which you not otherwise would not do. And given the circumstances, I can understand.
Let me ask if others in the audience have questions or comments they want to offer.
I got a question, David.
Rolly, yeah.
All this talk
this
about...
This is Roland Evans speaking.
The talk about Nazi Germany and Communist China, and then on the one hand, the talk about my little baby daughter and my poor old mother, obscures to me what the issue really is here, which is, I think, if we can bring it to a boil by asking this question of Jim and Ms. Gerlich and Mr. Haas, in your experience, put it all together, your experiences, have you ever seen or known of a situation where it became absolutely essential to use a member of the press in the way, I'm sorry to say I haven't read the book yet, in the way that apparently David Ignatius brings up in his book? Have you ever heard of any similar situation?
Not in my 2 years in the business, but I find them readily imaginable. I would think they'd be rare, but I can see how something like this that's in the book would come up. But personal experience, no.
Jamie?
No.
Mr. Haas? Richard?
No.
Let me ask Dick Helms, who's sitting next to you. Dick, do you remember an instance that would be analogous?
I don't know. I'm old and my memory is faulty. But I'd like to point out to this audience, to my personal knowledge, this argument has been going on for 50 years. And I assume the same kind of a discussion will go on for another 50 years. And we're never going to get this thing straightened out. There are no real pluses and no real minuses. We've all got to get together as patriots and sensible Americans and use decent judgment in these matters. And I think that the more you discuss this, the more blurred the whole thing becomes. And after all, I was a reporter for the United Press in 1936. Now, there was no CIA in 1936, and there was no American intelligence in 1936. So obviously this matter did not come up. But I can't possibly see how I could have lived in greater jeopardy, whether I was a CIA man or a press man, in that particular climate in Germany in those days. If they didn't like you, they put you in jail. That was the end of that. And the same thing has been going on in the Soviet Union. So I think we're getting a little precious here in American society. And why don't we all go back to work and use good judgment and good sense, and we'll be all right.
Dick, you're mentioning your own work for the UPI. Gives me a chance to ask you a question I've always wanted to ask. Which is more fun, being a reporter or being a spy?
That's a bad question.
Rupert Cohen knows.
Well, that's right. There's a character in my book who's an intelligence officer who's desperate to become a journalist because he's convinced that we have the fun. Are there other questions from the audience? Sally Quinn?
Well, Bob had mentioned earlier about how he thought that if there was a situation that came up where the reporter would act as a CIA conduit, that he would talk it over the editors and then come back and eventually, when the whole thing was over, write about it. But wouldn't that cause the problem that you're talking about forever for that newspaper, that once you write about it, then everybody in the whole world will know that the Washington Post allows, or whatever newspaper allows its reporters to be agents?
Bob, what about that?
That's right. I think you'd pay a tremendous price, and it would have to be absolutely an exceptional circumstance. But an absolute rule, I mean, if you're going to save somebody's life and somebody says, just carry this message from here to there.
I'm not talking about doing it, I'm talking about later writing about it.
Well, I think you then have to write about it. I think, and in writing about it, hopefully you would make it clear how exceptional it is.
David, that raises a point. I think it's very unusual to have a situation where a journalist might help the CIA, but it's very commonplace to have situations where journalists could hurt the CIA. I mean, almost on a regular basis, intelligence agencies don't want to see stuff in print, and then you have these complicated, fractious debates about whether the newspaper is going to print it. I mean, I'm sure Ben and Len have been through this a million times. That's a much harder question to me, to which there are no rules, but it's also much more commonplace. Is when do you? I mean, in the old days, journalists were incredibly accommodating. The journalists knew about the Bay of Pigs before it happened and sort of sat on it. They knew about the U-2 spy plane and sat on it. And my favorite story is before our first great coup in Guatemala, I guess it was the CIA's second great coup, Sidney Grusin of the New York Times knew all about the coup. Allen Dallas picked up the phone. He called up one of the Sulzbergers and said, get your guy out of Guatemala City. The New York Times removed their reporter from Guatemala City, sent him to Mexico City, and the Times never printed a word. Can you imagine today if Jim Woolsey had picked up the phone and called up young Sulzberger and said, we're about to stage a coup in Guatemala. Would you please get your reporter out of there? You know, they don't make headlines big enough for the scoop that the Times would have had. It would have been a huge explosion. So Times have just completely changed on that score.
Absolutely.
But they haven't changed so much that there isn't still a good listening ear in the media when an intelligence agency, or for that matter a law enforcement agency, calls and says, if you print this now, you're going to have a significant effect on our national security. I mean, that happens, and I think that it is not all that different from the kind of conversation that we're talking about.
Where this normally comes up as a DCI is the risk of blowing a source, of an informant having enough attributed to him substantively that it's clear who or where he is, of some technical capability being compromised. My own experience is that the top levels of the profession of journalism are quite responsible about this matter. I've had a number of discussions on sensitive matters with people that I thought worked out generally well. As Eric says in the book, journalists understand this sort of thing. He called his informants, speaking of the CIA officer, he called his informants agents and paid them money. I called them sources and gave them other kinds of rewards. I suppose that broke down more of the barriers, understanding that we were in similar fields. Journalists understand about protecting sources.
I should just say for people who aren't in the news media that the Washington Post, I think most major newspapers, has a policy when we're contemplating running a particularly sensitive story where there's a question of people getting injured or major damage to national security, of talking that through with the affected agency, of giving them a chance to talk us out of it. And I assume you've had those conversations.
More than one occasion.
Jim. We have time for another question or two from the audience. Nora?
I just wanted to say something.
This is Nora Bustani, a reporter for the Washington Post who's been a war correspondent for more than a decade.
There is no real division between what journalists do and intelligence agents do. We journalists are valuable sources of intelligence. Therefore, we deserve to be protected. You know, as someone who has been in various situations, whether in Iraq or at the Syrian border or even in Beirut during the hostage crisis when they ran out of Americans, it always heartened me to be able to say, our newspaper has absolutely nothing to do with the American government. You cannot treat me like that. You cannot not allow me in. And I'd often, you know, in touring some embassies in the Middle East, people would say, how did you get that information? Well, just by being almost a fanatic about saying we have nothing to do with the American government. We care about the truth. And journalists take risks. And if some people in the government need to take risks sometimes by breaking the law, they should do the same. But journalists are, I think, are entitled to this protection of never being suspected of being an agent or a spy.
Can I just answer that?
Yeah, Richard Haas.
Nor there's nothing in this that would preclude any newspaper or television organization from having an absolute policy that would prohibit them from any sort of cooperation on any level with any aspect of the intelligence community. I think that's a perfectly legitimate policy, even a no-waiver policy if the Washington Post or anyone else wants to adopt it. All I would suggest is I'm not sure the U.S. government has the same luxury, but I agree. I think you should be able to say, my newspaper has an absolute ban on this sort of association, and that's just a fact. I think that's perfectly legitimate, and you know, I think the U.S. government would have to accept the fact that many organizations would be unwilling to cooperate even if they were approached.
Is there a final question in the audience? If not, I note that some of our colleagues have already had to go back to their offices and start putting out tomorrow's newspapers. I want to thank all of you for coming, especially thank the members of the panel, and thank Random House for putting this together. Thank Nora's Restaurant for a fabulous lunch, and thanks again.
Random House wants one group picture.